Welcome to Quiet Ember Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from this evening? And how is the light fading, or perhaps just beginning, where you are? If you wish to share, I read every note, and I cherish the quiet company we keep across distances, like small lamps glowing in far-off windows. If these gentle stories bring you rest, a like and subscribe helps this little corner of the night grow, so that more weary minds can find their way here. Tonight, we return to the world of Sherlock Holmes, though not quite as you may have walked it before. This is a Holmesian mystery, with a quiet Gothic twist, a tale of a room that will not stay silent, even when the door is locked and the fire has burned low. Yet every detail is told in a soothing, unhurried way, shaped not to startle you awake, but to accompany you gently toward sleep. You are not here to solve anything quickly. All will be revealed momentarily, and even then, only as softly as falling snow. We will find ourselves with Dr. Watson as our guide, in a snowbound manor set apart from the world, its stone walls wrapped in winter darkness, its windows holding a faint amber glow against the drifting white. Within, there is a long library paneled in dark wood, where the shelves rise like quiet sentinels, and the leather bindings catch the firelight, while somewhere behind those books and beams, old pipes, hidden cavities, and narrow servant passages may be carrying whispers from one forgotten corner to another. The wind outside moves through chimneys and over the roof, and the house answers with creaks and sighs that could, to a sleepless mind, sound almost like footsteps or voices. In that murmuring library, we will hear the soft scratch of pen on paper as Watson sets down the case, pausing now and then to listen, to wonder whether the faint breath of sound behind him is merely the settling of timbers or something more deliberate. Holmes, calm and methodical, will move through the shadows with his usual precision, yet his presence here is meant to be soothing rather than sharp, his observations like slow, measured notes on a violin rather than sudden flashes of deduction. This is a space where stories move at a gentle pace, where nothing demands quick thinking or alertness, and where it is perfectly acceptable for your attention to ebb and flow like a quiet tide. Imagine the world of Baker Street forming gently around you, each breath sketching another line, each exhale deepening the shadows and the light. The amber glow of the fire takes shape first, casting long, wavering reflections across the well-worn Persian carpet, while the soft ticking of the mantel clock begins to keep company with your own steady pulse. The sitting room of 221B gathers itself out of the quiet, piece by comfortable piece. There is the leather armchair by the hearth, its arms smoothed by years of Watson's thoughtful repose, and opposite it, the straight-backed chair where Holmes so often leans, fingertips pressed together, eyes half-closed in contemplation. The air holds the faint aroma of pipe tobacco and old leather-bound books, mingled with a whisper of coal smoke, creating a soothing, almost scholarly fragrance that seems to slow the day's thoughts without effort. Beyond the window, winter has laid its quiet hand upon London. Snow drifts past the glass in slow, deliberate flakes, catching the gaslight in pale, silvery flashes before settling on the ledge, and the usual rumble of wheels and voices below is muffled into a distant murmur, as though the city itself were wrapped in a woolen blanket. Have you noticed how, on such nights, even footsteps in the street seem to hesitate, as if reluctant to disturb the hush? Inside, the room answers that quiet with its own gentle sounds. The coal fire sighs and shifts, sending up occasional sparks that dance briefly against the iron grate, The clock offers its measured, reassuring beat. Somewhere in the corner, a floorboard gives a soft, familiar creak, not as an alarm, but as a reminder that this is a place lived in, known, safe. This sitting room has long been a sanctuary from rain and snow, from tangled cases and from the weight of the world beyond the stair. For Holmes, it is the workshop of his remarkable mind. For Watson, it is a harbor between journeys and night calls. And for us, returning once more to these chairs and these shadows, it has become a quiet refuge as well, a space where soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts can gently carry you toward peaceful sleep. Tonight, as the snow thickens outside and the fire burns low, we shall find that this sense of safety will be tested by a room that refuses to remain silent, a snowbound manor far from Baker Street, whose whispers reach even here, into the heart of London, and draw Holmes and Watson away from their familiar hearth and out into the waiting night. And yet, before those distant whispers could lay claim to the night, Baker Street itself held us in a quiet, familiar embrace, as if the house wished to keep us a little longer by its comfortable fire, before releasing us to the snowbound unknown. Holmes stood at the window. His tall, spare figure was outlined against the pale winter light that filtered through the thin veil of London fog, the gas lamps below appearing as soft, blurred halos rather than points of flame, while the glass before him showed, in faint reflection, the aquiline profile and steady gaze that so many a criminal had learned to dread. Though in that quiet evening it was turned only upon the drifting snow and the slow procession of cabs along Baker Street. He had drawn back the curtain with one hand, yet the other rested idly upon the sill, long fingers relaxed rather than tense, his eyes half-lidded in that deceptive languor which I had come to recognize as the prelude to some new chain of thought, his whole attitude one of repose, and yet, to those who knew him, of watchfulness, like a hound that seems to doze yet misses no sound. Behind him the room glowed with a softer light, the amber from the fire mingling with the steady flame of the lamp upon the table, so that the familiar shadows of books, violin case, and chemical paraphernalia lay in comforting disorder about us. For my own part, I was seated in my accustomed armchair near the hearth, the evening paper spread upon my knee, the rustle of its pages answering, in a modest domestic counterpoint, the gentle crackle of coal in the grate and the occasional sigh of wind at the chimney. At my elbow stood a small tray, with a pot of tea that Mrs. Hudson had left not 10 minutes before, and, as I paused in my reading to stir a little more sugar into the cup, the faint, delicate clink of porcelain and spoon seemed, in that quiet, to take on a significance out of all proportion to its sound, as though the room itself listened and approved. There was, in that moment, a sense that we might simply settle in, get comfortable, allowing the long day to fall away in soft layers, while the light faded and the room grew more intimate, its corners gently surrendered to shadow. Outside, the clip-clop of hooves upon the snow-damp street reached us in softened echoes, the usual rattle of wheels subdued by the whitening roadway, so that London, that great restless organism, seemed to us like a tired creature breathing more slowly in its sleep. Holmes spoke without turning. "Observe, Watson, the pattern of the footprints opposite," he murmured, his tone so mild that it hardly broke the soothing spell of the room. "Our neighbor at number 31 has taken to pacing between his door and the corner, always the same 12 yards, always with a pause at the gas lamp. A mind that turns upon itself will often wear such paths into the snow." I folded the paper and regarded his back with an affection that had deepened through years of shared peril and quiet companionship. "You deduce melancholy, then, from so little?" I asked, though more for the pleasure of hearing him elaborate than from any doubt of his conclusion. "Not melancholy," he replied, letting the curtain fall so that the room seemed at once to draw closer about us, "but preoccupation. The snow records his hesitation. The fog at the gutters records the wind. One has only to breathe with me as we begin to read such pages." There was the faintest suggestion of amusement in his voice, as if he knew that even in repose his mind could not resist the smallest problem set before it. I returned my gaze to the fire, watching the slow collapse of a coal as it broke, glowed fiercely for a moment, and then subsided into a more even, comforting heat. The quiet rhythm of such changes, the soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts that I sometimes attempted to set down in my journal, and the ever-present figure of Holmes moving, thinking, or simply standing by that window, had combined over the years to make of 201B Baker Street a sanctuary for me, a place where the noises of the world were filtered and gentled before they reached my ear. There had been times, in the wards and battlefields of my earlier life, when sound had meant only alarm and urgency, each cry or report demanding instant action. Now, the small domestic whispers of coal, kettle, and turning page seemed to carry me toward peaceful sleep rather than rouse me from it, and I cherished them as a man might cherish the murmur of a friendly stream after long marches through a desolate country. Was it any wonder that I clung to that sitting room with its mingled scents of tobacco and tea, as to a harbor from which I was loath to sail? Yet even in that harbor there were tides that could not be denied. Holmes moved away from the window with the unhurried grace of one who has come to a decision, crossed to the mantel, and took up a letter that had lain there, half buried among the day's correspondence, its thick, cream-colored envelope bearing, in one corner, the faint impression of a crest I did not at once recognize. He held it between finger and thumb, studying the broken seal with a thoughtful eye. "You remarked, Watson," he said quietly, "upon the comfort of our present tranquility." His gaze flickered, just for an instant, toward the door, as though he listened for something beyond it. "I wonder how far that comfort will endure when you learn from whom this letter comes, and what room in the country refuses, it seems, to remain silent even when all doors are locked and all fires are low." For a few heartbeats after Holmes's quiet remark, the only sound in our sitting room was the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the faint sigh of the fire as it settled upon the grate. The evening seemed to draw its own breath, as though it too waited to learn what room in the country could refuse obedience to silence. Holmes had resumed his place by the window, the thin curtain held back between forefinger and thumb, when his posture altered almost imperceptibly. He inclined his head, not toward the door and not wholly toward the street, but in that attentive, listening fashion I had come to associate with the moment before some new thread of our quiet existence was drawn gently, but inexorably, into a case. "We shall not have long to speculate, Watson," he murmured. "Our interesting visitor is within 100 yards. I heard nothing. Or rather, I believed I heard nothing until, obeying his gesture, I joined him at the window and allowed my senses to settle in, get comfortable upon the sounds that drifted up through the winter air. At first it was only the muffled undertone of London at night, subdued by the snow that lay in soft folds upon the street. But then there came, distinct yet cushioned, the slow, irregular crunch of wheels turning through slush, and the low, patient snort of a horse whose breath rose in pale clouds against the gas-lit gloom. Through the misted glass, the world beyond Baker Street appeared reduced to shadows and points of light. The cab's lantern, swinging gently with each movement of the animal, advanced toward us like a small wavering star, its glow broken and blurred by the fine film of condensation upon the pane, so that the whole scene seemed at once distant and intimately near. "Note, Watson," Holmes said softly, "the pace, not the brisk rattle of a man to whom minutes are money, nor yet the laggard crawl of common hire. Our driver has been instructed to proceed steadily despite the snow. That speaks of a passenger who values thought over haste." As the cab drew up opposite our door, we could just discern the figure within, a dark shape that leaned forward as if urging the conveyance on, then sat back again, hands clasped in a posture of controlled impatience. The door opened with a dull, padded sound, half swallowed by the snow-laden air, and a gentleman descended, his coat collar turned up high, his hat pressed low, his breath rising in quiet puffs that vanished almost as soon as they formed. His movements, though outwardly composed, betrayed a certain urgency in the quick, decisive way he paid the driver and turned toward our steps, only to have that urgency softened at once by the thick whiteness that muffled every tread. We heard, faintly, the cab door close again, the horse shake its head with a soft jingle of harness, and the wheels retreat, their sound diminishing along the street until it merged once more with the distant whispers of the winter evening. Within the house, another sequence of gentle notes began to play itself out. The low creak of the front door as Mrs. Hudson admitted our caller, her subdued greeting floating up the stair in a tone of respectful curiosity, followed by the measured, deliberate ascent of footsteps upon the carpeted steps. There was no haste in that approach, yet no hesitation either, only the steady rhythm of a man who has resolved upon a course and now walks it to the end. Holmes, having let the curtain fall back into place, resumed his chair with an air of composed expectation. "Breathe with me as we begin, Watson," he said mildly, his eyes glinting with that familiar, quiet fire. "All will be revealed momentarily, and I suspect our room that will not stay silent may prove, in time, to carry you toward peaceful sleep far less readily than you might wish." A pause followed, light and fragile as the thin layer of snow upon the window ledge. Then came the sound we had awaited, a knock upon our door, firm but not frantic. 3 calm strokes that seemed to balance perfectly between deference and determination. The gaslight flickered, the shadows in the corners drew a little closer, and in that soft, suspended instant before Mrs. Hudson's hand found the handle, I found myself wondering what manner of story must lie behind a man who came through such quiet to disturb so peaceful an evening, and what strange, reluctant voice might be calling to us from a distant room that refused, it seemed, to remain silent. The latch turned, and the door began very gently to open. A figure stepped through, and the quiet of our sitting room seemed to fold itself around her, as if even the air understood that this was not a tale to be told in any hurried or careless fashion. She was a gentlewoman of perhaps 35, wrapped in a traveling cloak still faintly dusted with the pale memory of snow. Her veil lifted back to reveal a composed, almost serenely arranged face, in which only the faint tightening at the corners of the mouth and the smallest tremor at the eyelids betrayed a quietly troubled spirit. Her gloved hands, resting in her lap as she took the chair Mrs. Hudson brought, turned one within the other in a slow, unconscious motion, like the soft twisting of ivy about an old stone. "The trains from the north have been delayed," she said in a low, careful voice, each word placed as though it might break if set down too quickly. "But I felt I must come at once, Dr. Watson. Mr. Holmes. My name is Lady Eleanor Ashcombe of Wintershall Manor, in the Durham Hills. We are snowbound most winters, and this year the snow has come early." She paused, listening a moment to the distant patter of rain outside our London window, as if contrasting it with the deep, muffled silence of her own estate. Holmes inclined his head, saying nothing. I noticed his eyes half close, not in weariness, but in that peculiar inward focus which meant that every syllable, every little twist of those gloved fingers was being quietly filed away. "It is our library, Mr. Holmes," she continued, and at the word there seemed to pass, between the three of us, a gentle understanding of what such a room should be. A sanctuary of quiet thought and soft light. An old room from the earliest part of the house. The shelves rise almost to the ceiling, dark oak carved with leaves, and little faces long since worn smooth. There is paneling all about, and a great stone hearth where the fire burns low of an evening, casting long shadows up the spines of the books. It is a comfortable room by day and even by dusk when the lamps are lit, but at night she drew in a slow breath. At night, when the door is locked and the fire has sunk to embers, the room will not stay silent. The phrase so quietly spoken seemed to settle in the air between us. You may imagine, as we did, that curious tension when a familiar place misbehaves, when something meant to soothe begins to whisper instead. Every night, Lady Eleanor went on, at precisely midnight, never a minute before nor after, there begin the faintest murmurs, as though someone were speaking on the far side of a closed door, and one catches only the shape of the words, not the words themselves. Then come little sighs, and the suggestion of footsteps crossing the carpet, very soft, very measured. As the wind rises outside, the sounds grow clearer, as if the weather itself were drawing them out of the walls. Yet when the door is opened, there is no one within. The windows are barred, the corridor is empty. The fire by then is almost gone, and the room listens. She glanced from Holmes to myself. My family believes the library is haunted. There was, long ago, some scandal connected with it, so the older servants say, but the details are lost in half-remembered whispers. My husband will not enter it after dark. The maids cross themselves when they pass the door. They tell one another that the dead will not let the room rest. Her lips pressed together a moment, then eased. I do not know what to believe. I am not insensible to tales of spirits, yet I cannot help but think there must be some rational cause. I hoped, her voice softened further, I hoped you might find it, Mr. Holmes, and perhaps in doing so, restore a little peace to our house and to those who must sleep beneath that restless room. For a time, there was only the quiet ticking of the mantel clock and the soothing whisper of rain along Baker Street's windows. If you settle in, get comfortable, you might picture Holmes as I saw him then, long fingers steepled, lashes resting lightly against his cheek, as though he were half asleep and dreaming over the puzzle presented to him. At length he opened his eyes. A faint light, almost of amusement but tempered by sympathy, touched them. A room, he said, that chooses its hour and speaks more clearly as the wind rises. An excellent arrangement of facts, Lady Eleanor. We shall endeavor to discover why your library prefers to converse at midnight rather than remain decorously mute. He rose, moved into the window where the street lamps cast pale bands of light across the glass. You may set aside for the present all thoughts of ghosts, he added, very calmly. We are dealing, I suspect, not with the caprice of the dead, but with the habits of the living, and with a house that has learned some curious ways of carrying its own whispers." He turned back to her, and in his voice there was something almost soothing. "All will be revealed momentarily, Lady Eleanor, though we must first let Wintershall Manor tell us, in its own fashion, how it has come to speak in the night." In that gentle assurance, and in the soft certainty of his tone, I felt the mystery shift, just a little, from a source of fear to an intriguing, quiet invitation, one that would, I sensed, carry you toward peaceful sleep, even as we prepared to follow those midnight murmurs into the snowbound north. Holmes did not at once reach for his hat or his notebook. Instead, he leaned back, steepling his fingers, and allowed a faint, almost amused smile to touch his lips, as though the room's nocturnal protests were an old acquaintance rather than a looming terror. "Mrs. Markham," he said at last, his voice as quiet and even as the falling evening rain beyond our windows. "Ghosts do not follow timetables. Criminals do." The line was delivered without sting, almost as one might remark upon the weather, and in that gentle dryness the air in the sitting room seemed to loosen, the shadows about our guest's anxious features softening, as if the very syllables had drawn some of the sting from her fears. Holmes let the words settle, like snow upon an empty field, before he continued, his tone reflective rather than dismissive. "We speak of a silent library," he mused, "yet silence, in a house of years, is rarely as complete as we imagine. The walls remember, pipes murmur, timbers answer the changing temperature with little sighs and protests, and the smallest cavity behind a bookcase may act as a throat, catching the wind and shaping it into whispers." He turned his gaze to the fire, watching the coals shift with a soft, subsiding crackle. It is the mind confronted with such a quiet stage that supplies the actors and the dialogue. His words stirred my own recollections. How many times in lonely lodgings or country inns had I lain awake, listening to a regular tap that seemed at first an insistent signal from some unseen watcher, only to discover in the morning a loose shutter, a faulty water pipe, or the patient drip of rain along a misaligned gutter. I remembered a staircase in my bachelor days that groaned under no visible weight, until a carpenter's examination revealed warped boards that moved with each gust from a badly fitted window. At the time, those sounds had seemed, to a tired mind in a dark corridor, almost purposeful. Had you not at some point listened in just that way, feeling the quiet press in until it almost spoke? Holmes, as if following this train of thought, went on in that same soothing cadence that seemed designed to soft-spoken tales, to slow the day's thoughts. Victorian houses, particularly those of a Gothic persuasion, are like people who have learned to keep secrets. They were built with concealed servant corridors, speaking tubes that carry a whisper from attic to scullery, and staircases whose curves and hollows will take a sound from one end of the house and deposit it, quite transformed, at the other. A single word, dropped carelessly in a distant chamber, may arrive at the library door as a breath, a murmur, an indistinct call. He glanced to me then, a glint of humor in his eye, as though inviting me to contest his catalogue of domestic phantoms. I merely nodded, for I had seen him, more than once, trace a mysterious knock to an old heating pipe, or explain an ominous thud by the simple settling of a bookcase as the night cooled. In one case, a supposed midnight footstep had proved to be nothing more than a loose pane in a skylight, lifted and dropped by the wind with uncanny regularity. All will be revealed momentarily, he might have said, had he been inclined to theatrics. Instead, he simply listened, and the house in time confessed. He said now, turning back to our visitor, "We have a room that refuses to remain quiet, but only when the door is locked and the fire is low. That is not the caprice of a spirit. That is a pattern. And where there is a pattern, there is a cause, whether of human design or natural contrivance, waiting to be heard." He rose then, not with abruptness, but with the unhurried grace of a man preparing for a familiar ritual. "We shall go to Wintershall, Dr. Watson and I, and we shall listen. If you will permit it, Mrs. Markham, we will let your library speak in our presence. Settle in, get comfortable in your mind, for this is no contest with the supernatural, but an opportunity to hear, beneath the fear, the true story your house has been telling for years. Breathe with me as we begin, for in the quiet between those midnight murmurs, I believe we shall find both the mechanism and the motive, and perhaps in understanding them, restore to your home the gentle silence it has so long been denied." The cab that bore us from Baker Street drew up beneath the broad iron canopy of the station, and at once the whole character of the night seemed to change, as though London itself were drawing a deep, slow breath before sleep. The great terminus, which by day roared with voices and steam, now lay subdued beneath the quiet evening, its vast spaces softened by mist and the fine, unhurried fall of snow that drifted in through the open arches. Lamps glowed in that mist like small, steadfast planets, each haloed in a pale corona of light, while above them the iron ribs of the roof vanished into shadows that swallowed sound and movement alike. The muffled scrape of trunks upon the platform, the distant calling of porters, and the occasional soft hiss of a locomotive letting off its breath all combined into a low, continuous murmur, so soothing in its constancy that one might almost mistake this place of departure for a chapel of sleep. If you settle in, get comfortable, you may hear that same murmur echoing faintly in your own thoughts. Holmes and I passed along the platform, our footsteps deadened by the damp boards, until we reached the appointed carriage of the northbound express, its dark, gleaming sides reflecting the lamps in wavering streaks. A porter, moving with the unhurried efficiency of one long accustomed to such nocturnal ritual, opened the door of our compartment, and in another moment we were alone within a small, self-contained world of polished wood, brass fittings, and softly cushioned seats that embraced rather than merely received the weary traveler. Holmes hung our coats upon the brass hooks with that precise, economical movement which characterized even his smallest actions, and then drew down the blind against the drifting snow, so that the interior became a little chamber of amber and shadow. A single lamp, shaded in frosted glass, cast a pool of gentle light over his aquiline features and the curve of his closed eyelids, over the gleam of the window frame and the faint pattern of the upholstery, while beyond the glass the station lamps receded into a blur of pale circles. There came, as the hour struck, the quiet clang of doors along the train, like a series of distant notes struck upon a muted bell, followed by a pause so complete that it seemed the entire building held its breath. Then, with a soft, persuasive tug, the carriage stirred, the couplings tightened, and the midnight express began to move. Slowly at first, then with gathering purpose, the rails beneath us taking up a gentle, measured song. The wheels found their rhythm, a soft clatter and click, click and clatter that ran under our feet like a subdued heartbeat, while the carriage itself swayed with a cradle-like motion that invited the body to loosen its tensions and the mind to follow. Soon the last of the station lamps slipped away, and there remained only the reflection of our own compartment upon the darkened window, as though we were suspended in a corridor of night with no landscape beyond. The distant whistle of the engine floated back to us, not as a sharp cry, but as a long, low note that rose and then dissolved into the snowy air, leaving in its wake a deeper quiet. Filled only by the steady breathing of the train and the soft whisper of wind along the carriage sides. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame at ease, his hands loosely folded upon his lap, and his head resting against the padded corner of the seat. To any casual observer he might have appeared to be dozing, for his eyes were closed and his features composed into an expression of complete repose. Yet I, who had watched him upon many a journey, knew that behind those shuttered lids his mind was already traveling ahead of us, tracing the architecture of that troubled manor room, measuring in imagination the thickness of its walls, the angles at which sound might strike and return, the hidden channels by which a whisper could become a voice, and a creak, a footstep. The train rocked gently on, its motion so regular that it seemed less a form of travel than a kind of extended exhalation, an invitation to let each mile carry away another layer of wakefulness. Outside, the snow fell unseen over fields and villages, over quiet roads and sleeping houses, while within our compartment the lamplight held steady, a small, unwavering star in a universe of darkness. You may notice as you listen how the repeated rhythm of wheels and rails, of swaying carriage and distant whistle, begins to mirror the slow rise and fall of your own breathing. Each sound, another step away from the day that has passed. Whether you follow every word, tracing with us the line of reasoning that leads from a restless library to the quiet heart of its secret, or whether the story becomes for you only a background of soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. The train will continue to bear us northward, untroubled by your drifting attention. In this, it resembles sleep itself, which does not demand that we watch each moment of our descent, but simply asks that we allow ourselves to be carried. All will be revealed momentarily, but there is no need to hasten, for now we travel together through the night, the room that would not stay silent waiting, patient and unseen, at the end of the line. And so the journey brings us at last to stillness, not of mind, but of motion, as the train begins to ease its headlong rush and drift toward its snowbound destination. The change is almost imperceptible at first, a subtle slackening of that steady, iron heartbeat beneath the wheels, then a longer pause between the rhythmic joints of the rails, until even you can feel, as we did, that the night is preparing to open and receive us. Breathe with me as we begin this quiet arrival. The hiss of steam grew louder as our speed diminished, spreading in soft white clouds along the platform like a second restless snowfall, while beyond the carriage window the dark outline of a rural station emerged, its lamps burning with a steady, golden patience against the deepening evening. It was one of those forgotten country halts, where the world seems to pause between one breath and the next, the thick snow lying undisturbed upon the boards, save for a few recent footprints and the faint parallel scars of a handcart's passage. When at last we stepped down, the sudden quiet after the journey's long murmur felt almost like entering a church. Our client, Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, led us toward a waiting carriage, its wheels already half buried in the snow, the horse steaming gently in the cold as though it too had been fashioned from breath and cloud. The road from the station wound between white fields and dark hedgerows, the branches bowed beneath their wintry burden, so that from time to time they brushed the carriage roof with soft whispering taps that might, in a more fanciful mood, have been taken for cautious fingers. Ahead of us the sky remained dim and low, but, little by little, a shape began to gather out of the shadows, first as a smudge, then as a jagged line, and at last as the full brooding silhouette of the manor itself, its upper windows glowing like watchful eyes that had been waiting some time for our arrival. As we drew closer, more lights revealed themselves, scattered across the facade in a pattern that suggested both welcome and wariness, as though the house were considering us. You know that peculiar comfort of seeing a lit window on a winter's night, when the snow muffles every sound and the world seems very far away? It was like that, and yet something in the angle of the gables, in the steep fall of the roof and the narrowness of certain windows, hinted at secrets that preferred the dark. Holmes, peering out beside me, murmured something about Victorian building quirks and the way sound could travel along hidden cavities. Miss Ashcombe, perhaps wisely, chose not to pursue the remark. The great front door opened to our knock with a reluctance that might have been imagination, and we stepped into an entrance hall whose air was warmer, but not yet fully comfortable, as though the fire at its heart lay some rooms away. The ceiling rose high above us, vanishing into pockets of shadow between polished beams, while on either side tall portraits regarded our intrusion from their frames, their painted eyes catching the light in a manner that made them seem almost to shift as we passed. The scent of beeswax hung gently in the air, mingling with the dry, faintly musty fragrance of old paper and leather. And from somewhere deeper within the house there came the soft, irregular crackle of a fire. Its presence felt more as a promise than a present heat. Here the manor began to reveal its character, not in grand gestures but in small, suggestive details that Holmes, with his usual economy of movement, took in at a glance. A narrow door stood half open near the main staircase, and through it we glimpsed the tight twist of a servant's stair, its steps worn to shallow hollows in the center, disappearing upward into darkness. A small brass grille, no larger than a man's hand, was set high upon one wall, its pattern delicately worked, as though meant to be decorative, and yet positioned at a height more convenient for listening than for ornament. The corridors themselves did not run straight, but turned out of sight with a kind of deliberate coyness, offering short vistas of carpet and paneling before slipping away around some unseen angle. Speaking tubes, most likely, Holmes observed in a low voice, his gaze resting for a moment on the grille, or some cousin of them. One might hold a very private conversation in such a house and have it overheard in quite a different wing. "Is that your experience of country hospitality, Holmes?" I asked, for there was a gentle lightness in his tone that suggested he was not yet prepared to be solemn. "In my experience, Watson," he replied, "houses remember more than their owners suspect, especially houses with as many lungs as this one." Before I could press him on this curious phrase, Miss Ashcombe had crossed the hall and was leading us along a passage where the carpet deadened our footsteps to a quiet, almost conspiratorial hush. The air grew perceptibly warmer as we advanced, and the distant fire sound resolved itself into the comforting crackle of a substantial hearth, punctuated now and then by the soft fall of a shifting log. On our left and right doors opened at intervals, some closed, some ajar, each hinting at further comfortable rooms with lamplight and the gleam of polished wood. But it was toward the end of the corridor that our hostess guided us, to a door somewhat broader than the rest, its dark surface burnished by many years of touch. "The library," she said, and her voice, though steady, carried that subdued tension we had already learned to recognize in those who sought Holmes's aid. She drew a key from her pocket, its metal catching a stray thread of light, and set it to the lock, but did not at once turn it. Instead, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the cool brass, her head inclined as if listening. In the quiet that followed, with the manor's many small sounds gathered close around us, the distant ticking of a clock, the soft settling of timbers, the almost inaudible sigh of wind along some unseen chimney, it seemed to me that she held her breath, and that the house, very faintly, did the same. "Do you hear anything?" Holmes asked after a moment, his eyes not on the door but on her face. Miss Ashcombe hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the whole uneasy history of the room beyond. "Sometimes," she whispered at last, "when the door is locked and the fire is low. Tonight, perhaps." She broke off, and for a heartbeat longer we all stood there, listeners at a threshold, while the unseen library, patient and unseen no longer, waited on the other side of the wood. Then, with a small, decisive movement that seemed to cost her more than she would admit, she turned the key. The key turned with a muted click, and the door yielded. For a moment we stood upon the threshold, and the room so long spoken of in whispers revealed itself not as a place of terror, but as a pool of gentle evening light and cultivated comfort, waiting quietly for us to step within. The lamps had been lit in anticipation. Their soft, amber glow fell in calm circles upon rows of books that climbed the walls, leather spines and faded cloth bindings catching the light with a subdued sheen, while the polished wood of shelves and paneling reflected it back in darker, warmer tones, like still water under lanterns on a sheltered quay. A large rug, thick and intricately patterned, spread from hearth to desk, yielding slightly underfoot in a way that invited one to settle in, get comfortable, as though the room itself offered a kindly armchair to any who crossed its border. At the far end, the fire burned with a well-tended, steady flame. There was no roar, no restless crackle, but a quiet, sustained glow, the coals banked so that the heat was firm yet soothing, sending out waves of warmth that met us at once, as if in welcome after the chill corridors beyond. Above it rose a great carved mantel, its dark surface adorned with leaves, scrolls, and small attentive faces whose features had been softened by time and smoke until they seemed more suggestion than sculpture, watching without quite admitting that they did so. The ceiling was higher than I had expected, lifting the eye upward to a pale expanse crossed by age-darkened beams. Sound behaved curiously there. Our footsteps, though muted by the rug, sent a faint echo upward, where it seemed to hesitate and then drift away among the shadows of the rafters, as though reluctant to return. When Holmes spoke, his voice traveled out, rose, and came back to us gentled, its edges blurred by distance and wood and books, so that even his briskest observation arrived at my ear as something almost reflective. Certain features drew the gaze again and again. Near the windows stood a heavy writing desk, its surface cleared save for a blotter and a single waiting lamp, but its many small drawers bore neat brass keyholes, each with the discreet, closed look of a secret kept for many years. To the right of the hearth, a towering bookcase seemed, by some trick of carpentry or of the eye, to lean ever so slightly inward as if bending to listen, its upper shelves disappearing into a dimness where titles could no longer be read, only guessed at. Holmes moved into the room with that feline quietness which I had come to know so well. He passed a hand lightly over the paneling, fingers spread, as though feeling for a pulse beneath the wood. Now and then he paused, placed his ear close to a seam, and gave a delicate tap with the knuckle of one forefinger, listening not, as our hostess might have feared, for disembodied presences, but for the more prosaic whispers of hollows, cavities, and hidden channels such as Victorian builders were fond of concealing behind apparently solid walls. A faint difference in tone here, a slightly quicker echo there, and I could see his eyes brighten, though he said nothing as yet. For my own part, I found my attention drawn back again and again to the fire, the warmth upon my hands, the familiar outline of Holmes's figure moving between hearth and shelves, the quiet rustle of his coat as he shifted his weight, all combined to create an atmosphere so comfortable that it seemed almost perverse to associate this room with unease. And yet beneath that comfort, another sensation persisted, subtle but distinct, as though the library were itself a listener, its tall cases and paneled walls leaning inward to catch every word and footfall we offered it. I told myself sternly that this was mere fancy, born of our hostess's story and the long journey through snow and gathering night. Rooms do not listen. They merely receive. Still, as Holmes tapped once more at a section of wall beside the leaning bookcase and paused, head tilted in that familiar attitude of concentrated attention, I could not shake the impression that we were no longer the only observers. Somewhere in the quiet play of light and shadows, in the way the echoes softened and returned, there was a sense of expectancy, as if the room, patient and composed, had been waiting many years for someone who knew how to ask the right questions. Holmes straightened at last, his gaze traveling slowly from the mantel to the high ceiling, then down to the rug at our feet. "You observe, Watson," he murmured, "that this library is not so silent as it pretends." His tone was mild, almost conversational, yet something in it made the tiny hairs along my neck stir. What, I wondered, would it say once he had fully taught it to speak? "Breathe with me as we begin to listen more closely. All will be revealed momentarily, though the answers, I suspected, would not be of the sort our nervous hostess anticipated." Holmes did not at once spring into activity. Instead, he allowed a quiet stillness to settle over our little group, as though he would first let the room accustom itself to the idea of being scrutinized. Then, with that air of unhurried assurance which could be as soothing as any lullaby, he turned to our hostess and proposed a plan so simple that its very plainness seemed to steady her nerves. "We shall remain here in the library until midnight," he said, his gaze traveling slowly over the high shelves and dark panels. "You, Mrs. Fairley, will retire as usual. The door will be locked upon us from without, the key left in the lock, and the fire allowed to sink to that treacherous level at which the so-called voices are accustomed to begin. If the room has anything to say, Watson and I shall be here to listen." The arrangement made and the household gradually withdrawn, the great library settled into its evening mood, the tall windows now only faintly silvered by the snow-bright night beyond, while the fire, once a robust blaze, began that slow, contemplative descent from leaping flame to thoughtful glow. The amber light dwindled along the carved mantel, and as the uppermost log surrendered, collapsing inward with a soft sigh, they sent up a brief, golden flutter before subsiding into a bed of deepening embers. Holmes moved with deliberate care about the room, his steps so quiet upon the thick carpet that they seemed but another element of the soothing atmosphere. In the very center of the floor, where the Persian pattern opened into a circle of pale threads, he set down his violin case, aligning it with almost mathematical precision so that any subtle vibration of the boards might betray itself in the faintest shift of its position. Upon the mantelpiece, where the firelight could still just touch it, he placed a plain glass of water, the surface smooth as polished steel, yet ready to quiver at the least disturbance of the air. "You observe, Watson," he murmured, "our little sentries against superstition, wood, water, and stringed wood again. Honest materials, far more dependable than the imagination when the night grows long." There was, I fancied, the gentlest trace of amusement in his voice, like a single bright thread woven through a dark tapestry. We drew 2 deep armchairs close to the hearth, not so near as to encourage drowsiness, yet near enough that the remaining warmth wrapped us in a comfortable cocoon against the cold stone of the manor. The light had fallen now to a low reddish glow, so that the books withdrew into shadow, and the ceiling beams seemed to float like quiet rafters above a dark sea. The small clock upon the mantel ticked with a steady, patient rhythm, each soft stroke a reminder that the appointed hour moved closer, whether we marked it or no. As we settled in, I found myself thinking, almost involuntarily, of your own quiet evenings, when the day's concerns grow dim and the mind begins to wander along its private corridors. Settle in, get comfortable. For in such moments the faintest sound can seem a message, and the softest whisper a summons. My thoughts drifted from case to case, from London's gaslit streets to this remote, snowbound refuge, until even those recollections thinned, and only the ticking clock, the occasional settling creak of the bookcases, and the low, contented sigh of the chimney remained. From time to time the wind shifted outside, and the great house answered with distant murmurs, perhaps a hidden corridor stirring, or an old speaking tube giving back a breath of air to some forgotten room. But within the library itself there was only the slow fading of the light and the deepening of the shadows. The glass of water stood unruffled, the violin case lay motionless, and Holmes, his long fingers steepled, watched them both with half-closed eyes that missed nothing. The hands of the little clock crept onward. The fire had sunk now to a thin red line among gray ash, so that the room was very nearly dark, its corners filled with a quiet that seemed almost expectant. Holmes rose once to see the bolt shot home upon the door, testing it with a firm, decisive hand before returning to his seat. We spoke no further. In that gentle, breath-held silence, with the door secured, the windows curtained, and the house around us sleeping, we waited to learn whether this room would indeed refuse to stay silent when the last ember finally dimmed, and what, if anything, it might dare to say. The last ember dimmed. In that instant of almost perfect dark, when the glow within the grate had sunk to a quiet, sullen red, there came, so softly that I at first mistook it for the memory of sound rather than sound itself, a faint, almost conversational murmur, drifting, as it seemed to me, from the direction of the fireplace rather than from any visible mouth in the room. It was as though the stone and brick behind the iron grate had chosen that precise moment to exchange confidences. Holmes did not start. He did not so much as open his eyes. Instead, he inclined his head a fraction, like a man adjusting a delicate instrument, his long figure sinking more comfortably into the worn embrace of the armchair, while his fingers began to tap, light and regular, upon the carved wooden arm, keeping time with the intermittent rise and fall of that elusive whispering. We might have been in Baker Street, listening to the rain upon the window, so unhurried and composed was his attitude. For my own part, I found the sound peculiarly disquieting, not because it resembled any intelligible speech, but precisely because it did not. It was a pattern of sibilants and soft consonants, a suggestion of words without their bones. Like someone speaking in the next room with the door mostly closed, so that one caught the rhythm of sentences and the gentle swell and fall of emphasis, but none of the meaning that should properly attend them. More than once I caught myself leaning forward, straining to distinguish a phrase that surely, if I listened just a little harder, would resolve itself. It never quite did. Around that central murmur, the old library began to contribute its own subdued chorus. From the tall bookcase nearest the door, there came a soft, measured creak, as though the laden shelves, relieved of the fire's warmth, had shifted infinitesimally in their frame. Somewhere in the paneling behind us, the timber gave a long, low sigh, the sort of settling exhalation one hears in country houses on cold evenings, when the temperature drops and the day's heat withdraws from hidden spaces. Then, from deep within the wall by the chimney breast, there sounded a distant, hollow tap, irregular yet insistent, which might have been a pipe shrinking in its casing, or a beam easing itself by some fraction of an inch. "Breathe with me as we begin," Holmes murmured, not opening his eyes, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. The house is doing the same. There was a quiet humor in the remark, and it steadied me more than any protestation of disbelief in the supernatural could have done. We had, after all, heard old pipes in London lodgings make stranger music than this, and I knew that certain churches and galleries were famed for those curious acoustic tricks by which a whisper in one corner is borne, clear as a bell, to another. "Observe the sequence, Watson," he added, his tapping fingers pausing, then resuming in a slightly altered tempo. "The murmur when the embers sink, the creak as the bookcase cools, the sigh in the panel, and only then the tap in the flue. It is not chaos, it is a routine, a timetable. It was a pattern interrupt to my own unease, a timetable, not a haunting. Criminals, he had once told me, follow timetables. Ghosts, if they exist, do not." I felt the room shift, not in its fabric, but in my perception of it, from something vaguely oppressive to something almost instructive, as if we had come not to be frightened by it, but to attend a quiet lecture in wood and stone. "Settle in, get comfortable," he said softly, as though addressing not only me but you as well, wherever you may be listening to this gentle midnight experiment. "We are in the presence of a most articulate structure. It has been speaking for years, I fancy, only no one has thought to take notes." The murmur at the hearth rose again, a breathy susurration threading through the chimney, joined by a faint answering whisper that seemed to come from somewhere above the mantel, where the carved cornice met the ceiling. I could almost imagine, absurdly enough, that the house possessed some network of unseen channels and cavities, those concealed servant corridors and speaking tubes one hears of in older country seats, through which the slightest draught might carry and distort a sound from some distant, unsuspected corner. "Do you mark," Holmes said quietly, "how the apparent voice grows clearer when the wind stirs outside and fainter when it falls away? The exterior air draws upon the flue, and the interior responds. The result is a sort of accidental instrument upon which the weather plays. Yet there is something more here than mere temperature and draft." His fingers had ceased their tapping. His attention, though his lids were lowered, seemed now to press outward into the dark, tasting it. The library answered him with another hollow tap from within the wall, followed by a minute crackle from the spine of some overburdened folio, and a fresh, almost human sigh from the paneling at our backs. The sequence repeated, not precisely, but with enough similarity to suggest, to my increasingly fascinated ear, that we were listening not to isolated accidents, but to variations upon a theme. "Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts," Holmes murmured, almost to himself, "and to carry you toward peaceful sleep if you are wise enough to let them. But for our purposes, we must remain awake a little longer." He rose then, very quietly, as though unwilling to disturb the delicate balance of sounds that had begun to weave themselves through the room, and crossed to the hearth. The dying embers gave off a faint, rosy light that just touched the planes of his face and the fine lines of concentration about his mouth. Extending one hand, he laid his palm flat against the panel of wall to the right of the fireplace, fingers spread, as if feeling for a pulse. For several breaths he stood thus, motionless, listening with his whole body. The murmuring in the flue seemed to gather itself, to travel impossibly along the wood beneath his hand, while the unseen tap within the wall responded with a single deliberate knock, like a question posed in some forgotten code. Holmes inclined his head, as though in courteous acknowledgement of an introduction. "Yes," he said at last, in a tone of quiet satisfaction that sent a more soothing chill along my spine than any tale of specters could have done. "The house is speaking quite plainly. If one knows how to listen, all will be revealed momentarily, Watson. For the present, let us attend to its whispers." The library seemed to listen with us. The quiet deepened until even the soft ticking of the mantel clock felt like a word spoken too loudly. Holmes moved first, with the easy, unhurried assurance of a man following a familiar map. He crossed to the great chimney breast, its dark stone mottled by years of smoke and evening shadows, and laid his long fingers flat against the carved surface, as though feeling for a pulse. The amber glow of the fire had sunk low, the light now a muted breath within the grate, and somewhere beyond the walls the wind and rain resumed their gentle, soothing conference along the eaves. "Attend, Watson," he murmured. "The house has a throat, and it is here." He began to tap, very softly, moving in a slow, methodical line along the stone and paneling, each quiet rap followed by a pause in which we too seemed to hold our breath. The sound changed almost imperceptibly, from the solid, confident note of honest masonry to a faintly hollow resonance, as if the wall had drawn in its breath and was reluctant to let it go. Holmes repeated the sequence, his head inclined, until at last he smiled in that subdued way of his which never failed to settle in, get comfortable, at the back of my mind as a promise of revelation. "Here," he said simply. His hand moved to a portion of the carved-over mantel where a cluster of oak leaves and acorns had been wrought with such care that one might have admired them 100 times without ever truly seeing them. With a light pressure of his thumb, one leaf yielded, tilting inward on a concealed pivot. A small brass grill, dulled by age to the color of old honey, slid into view no larger than a man's palm, its pattern so cleverly worked into the carving that it seemed an ornament rather than an opening. "A speaking tube," Holmes observed, his voice calm and almost tender with professional satisfaction. "Long disused, but not, I think, entirely forgotten. Breathe with me as we begin, Watson. The house is about to tell us where its whispers are born." He drew a pocket lamp from his dressing gown, its circle of pale light cutting a narrow path through the shadows, and together we followed the line of the chimney breast to a slim panel at its side. This, too, yielded to his touch, swinging inward to reveal a cramped passage scarcely wide enough for a man to turn, vanishing into darkness with a faint draught of colder air, scented with dust and old stone. We stepped within. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet with a quiet, questioning note, and the lamplight slid over walls of bare plaster and rough timber, the comfortable richness of the library reduced, in this hidden artery, to stark necessity. A few yards on, the passage broadened slightly, and we came upon a narrow servant staircase running obliquely behind the library wall. Its steps furred with undisturbed dust, save for 2 or 3 places where the gray veil had been brushed aside by recent passage. Holmes knelt, examining the faint scuffs with that absorbed attention which, even after long acquaintance, never failed to strike me anew. "You perceive," he said, how admirably such arrangements lend themselves to misapprehension. In these Victorian piles it was common enough to install speaking tubes, bells, and concealed corridors that a master might summon his household without the vulgarity of raised tones, and servants might glide unseen from floor to floor. A whisper at one end, carried along a metal throat, emerges at the other as something curiously altered, magnified in one register, diminished in another, so that the simplest phrase may, at a distance, resemble anything but itself. Add to that the peculiar geometry of these rooms, the paneling, the flues, the very angles of the ceilings, and you have, in effect, a man-made whispering gallery. Is it any wonder that a mind already prepared for apparitions should hear more than is truly spoken? He rose, letting the quiet gather again around us, the lamp describing a slow arc that picked out another smaller grill set low beside the stair, its mouth dark and waiting. The rain outside traced a patient rhythm along the roof, and somewhere below a door settled with a faint sigh, as though the whole house were listening at its own keyholes. Holmes regarded the second opening for a long moment. "We have learned," he said at last, "how the house may speak. Yet the question remains, who has taught it to keep such regular hours, and why should its confidences be reserved for midnight alone?" He turned the lamp toward the descending stair, where the disturbed dust trailed away into deeper shadow. "Come, Watson. The mechanism is no longer a mystery. The hand that employs it, however," he let the sentence fade, leaving only the soft hiss of the lamp and the waiting dark below, as if the next whisper might rise to meet us at any moment. The following afternoon the house seemed to draw a softer breath, as though the previous night's whispers had sunk back into the woodwork to rest. A pale winter light lay across the snow in the courtyard, and the distant hush of wind around the chimneys made a quiet accompaniment as we gathered once more in the library. Not for experiment now, but for remembrance. Lady Ashcombe sat near the window, her hands folded upon a small bundle of keys and a folded handkerchief, while Holmes, long limbs composed, occupied the armchair opposite, his gaze lowered in what appeared to be indifference, yet missed nothing. I took a place at the great desk, where the leather top, faintly cracked with age, bore the gentle scars of generations of ink and decision. "You must understand," our hostess began, her voice low but steady. "This room has heard more than any chapel." She spoke then of an older Ashcombe, a stern uncle whose will, drafted in this very library, had left the estate in dispute, of cousins who arrived smiling and departed in silence, of a dismissed servant, young, clever, and too well informed, sent away after some quarrel about missing papers and a locked drawer in the desk before me. As she spoke, the afternoon shadows lengthened upon the shelves, as if leaning in to listen. At her invitation, I drew open that very drawer, the key turning with a reluctant click that seemed louder than it was in the soothing hush of the room. Inside lay bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, legal drafts, and memoranda whose ink had paled to a gentle brown. The paper was thin and brittle under my fingers, yet the handwriting remained precise, full of deliberate loops and careful flourishes, like voices still trying to speak clearly through dust and time. Together we examined them, Lady Ashcombe leaning close as I read aloud short passages, references to the sealed stair behind the nursery corridor, notes on the upper nursery at the top of the house, now to be closed, and marginal remarks about servants to be kept from the library after dusk. The words were not dramatic, yet they carried the quiet weight of decisions that alter lives in ways no one can wholly foresee. "The sealed stair?" I asked, looking up. "A back way for nurses and maids," she replied. "It was walled up when the household was reduced. At least, that is the story we tell." There was the faintest suggestion that other stories existed, unspoken. Holmes, who had remained almost entirely silent, lifted his gaze at that. "And the legend of your restless library, Lady Ashcombe," he inquired gently, "does it date from before these disputes, or after?" She hesitated, the light catching the fine lines at the corner of her eyes. "After," she admitted. "It was during the quarrel over the will that the family first began to say the room would not stay quiet at night. Certain cousins were, shall we say, discouraged from searching old papers here alone." Holmes inclined his head, the smallest of movements. "Ghosts are remarkably convenient allies," he observed, "when one wishes to keep documents undisturbed." Who at that time most desired privacy in this room? Her answer was measured, but there was a trace of old feeling beneath the calm. Names were given, relationships outlined, the dismissed servant's knowledge hinted at rather than fully described, as though even now the house preferred its scandals spoken in undertones. As the light waned and the first suggestion of evening crept into the corners, the library felt less like a haunted chamber and more like a ledger of human choices written in ink and dust instead of ledgers and accounts. One could almost feel how a whispered story of a room that murmurs when locked might keep timid relatives away from a certain drawer or from a staircase best left unseen. If you settle in, get comfortable, you may sense it too, that the whispers we had heard were not the cries of the dead, but the soft echoes of arrangements never quite settled, of loyalties and exclusions and quiet manipulations stretching, like old timbers, across generations, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Holmes glanced toward the ceiling, where the hidden passage breathed its faint, cold air. "All will be revealed momentarily," he murmured, almost to himself. For houses, like people, seldom keep only one story behind a locked door. And in the soothing stillness that followed, the manor seemed to listen back, as though weighing how much more it was willing to confess. Holmes did not answer the manor's mute challenge with further poetry, but with the soft, practical movements of a man laying out instruments upon a table. "The time has come," he said quietly, "to let the house speak in its native tongue." He took up a small hammer and a length of India rubber tubing, his lean figure outlined against the library's low fire, where the last coals glowed with a faint, comforting light that threw long shadows up the carved bookshelves and into the darkened corners of the ceiling. We followed him into the corridor, our footsteps muffled by the thick runner, while somewhere above, the old timbers gave a single, patient creak, like a sleeper turning in bed. Holmes paused beside an exposed section of pipe, its metal skin dulled by years of dust and winter condensation, and tapped it, once, twice, then again at a point several yards farther along, listening with his head inclined, as though the house were answering in whispers only he could hear. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "In the quiet of an evening such as this, when the fire is low and the outside air sinks a few degrees, these metal veins of the house contract, just as wooden beams and shelves shift and settle. What to the untrained ear is a knock, a sigh, a gentle groan with almost human cadence, is in truth nothing more than the building breathing in response to the cold." As if to prove his point, a faint series of ticks and pops traveled along the pipe, disappearing into the gloom toward the library. "You will have noted," he continued, "that the family hear their visitor only at certain hours? Ghosts do not obey the thermometer, Watson, but iron most assuredly does." He led us up a narrow back stair where the air grew cooler and the light more uncertain, until we emerged into a cramped attic space beneath the eaves. There, half hidden behind an old wardrobe, a tarnished speaking tube rose from the floorboards, its mouthpiece hanging like some forgotten brass flower. Holmes wiped it with his sleeve, then glanced at me with the faintest hint of amusement. "Settle in. Get comfortable in the library, my dear fellow," he said. "We shall conduct a little experiment. Breathe with me as we begin, and attend closely to what you hear." A few minutes later, I stood once more upon the familiar rug, the room quiet save for the low murmur of the fire and the distant hush of wind and rain against the tall windows. The great ceiling arched above me, its panels curving inward in a way I had previously admired for its beauty alone, never suspecting that such a shape might carry whispers as deftly as any trained messenger. Holmes's voice, when it came, was no more than a thread of sound drawn through the walls. Somewhere far away, in that remote attic corridor, he must have bent to the tube and spoken. But what reached me was a blurred murmur, emerging at a particular patch of paneling near the far bookcase, the very spot, I recalled with a small shiver, where our hosts had pointed when describing their unseen speaker. "Can you distinguish the words, Watson?" came his clearer call a moment later as he entered by the door. I confessed that I could not, yet the tone, the rise and fall had been unmistakably human. The room itself had seemed to form the syllables, as though the curved wood and high vault conspired to become a whispering gallery, catching the faintest vibration and setting it afloat across the still air. Holmes crossed to the panel and tapped it lightly, then stepped back to the center of the carpet. "Here," he said, "the architecture gathers stray sounds, just as a lens gathers scattered light. A poker laid carelessly against a grate upstairs, a servant's remark in a side passage, the contraction of a pipe, each is taken up, softened, and delivered here, at the feet of an imaginative listener who has been told to expect a ghost. Is it any wonder that, in the quiet watches of the night, the mind supplies the missing consonants and turns murmurs into messages? I stood very still, listening now not to the house, but to my own thoughts, and was quietly astonished at how swiftly they had leapt only hours before to the most romantic explanation. How many such tales, I wondered, had been born from nothing more than cooling metal and kindly old wood. Holmes, observing me with that gentle, knowing gaze of his, seemed to read the question. "That," he said softly, "is why we must be tender with those who believe themselves haunted. The sounds are real enough. It is only their interpretation that has gone astray. Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts become, in certain company, stories to quicken the pulse." He let his hand rest for a moment upon the panel, as though thanking the room for its cooperation. "Come, Watson," he added, turning toward the door. "We have learned how the manner speaks. All will be revealed momentarily when we ask who has been teaching it what to say." And as we stepped back into the dim corridor, with its quiet lamps and drifting shadows, I felt that we had moved from the realm of spirits into that of very human intention, though the line between the two, on such an evening, seemed wonderfully thin and strangely soothing, as if the mystery itself were content to carry you toward peaceful sleep before yielding its final secret. It was, therefore, with a kind of quiet inevitability that Holmes, once we had rejoined our anxious hosts, announced that the experiment must be repeated, and that this time he would conduct it alone. The line between spirits and human intention, which had seemed so thin and strangely soothing a short while before, must, as he put it with a faint smile, be pressed upon until it either yields or proves itself an illusion. Lady Elmsworth protested in soft, tremulous phrases, and I confess that I added my own more practical objections, for the thought of leaving my friend in that restless room, with its murmurs and creaking whispers, did not sit altogether comfortably upon my conscience. Yet Holmes remained unmoved, explaining, in that even, unhurried tone which could itself almost carry you toward peaceful sleep, that a solitary watcher would be less likely to disturb delicate vibrations, and that any human agent at work would show a bolder hand if he believed his audience reduced. And so, as the evening deepened and the snow pressed its cool face more closely to the tall windows of the manor, the household retired by degrees, their footsteps fading along the corridors, doors closing one by one with a gentle finality, until it seemed that the entire house was drawing a long, slow breath before surrendering to the night. "We may settle in, get comfortable," Holmes remarked to me quietly as we paused at the threshold of the library, though I fear the room itself may have other intentions. Within, the light was kept low. The single lamp upon the great desk was turned down until its circle of radiance was no more than a muted pool upon the leather surface, while the modest fire upon the hearth had been encouraged only to a steady, crackling glow, sufficient to warm but not to roar. Holmes moved with deliberate care, placing a straight-back chair at a slight angle to the fireplace, where the heat would brush his side rather than dazzle his eyes, and setting his violin case upon the rug midway between the hearth and the door, precisely where any subtle tremor in the boards might cause it to shift or whisper against the floor. Upon the desk he laid a single slip of paper, no larger than a visiting card, and weighted it with a fountain pen whose metal clip just touched the edge, so that the least disturbance of air or vibration through the old wood might send it pivoting. Such devices, he murmured, had unmasked more than one fraudulent medium in those fevered days of spiritualism. Victorian houses, with their concealed servant corridors and speaking tubes, were apt to carry voices in unexpected ways. But paper and pen remained loyally honest. When at last I left him, his long form settled in the chair and his hands loosely folded, the room received me into the corridor with a sigh of hinges and the soft click of the key turning in the lock from within. "Breathe with me as we begin," he had said earlier in the evening, half in jest, and I found myself doing so now, drawing a steadying breath as I walked away, listening to the wind rise along the eaves and the far-off mutter of the sea beyond the snowbound fields. Midnight approached with that peculiar measured slowness that belongs only to great old houses. The fire, as Holmes had predicted, burned lower, its earlier crackle subsiding into occasional thoughtful pops, while the lamp's small flame hummed faintly, as if reluctant to disturb the gathering quiet. In such rooms, he had explained to us, the very shape of the paneling could create a kind of whispering gallery, where the sigh of a pipe or the settling of a beam might seem like distant speech. The mind, hungry for pattern in the silence, would supply the rest. It was in that deep, expectant stillness that the familiar sequence began anew. First came the gentle creak along the far wall, as though some invisible hand traced the join between two panels. Then a muted tap, not unlike the cautious testing of a stair by one who knows its treacherous note. Then, faintly, the almost conversational murmur that the family had taken for ghostly dialogue, rising and falling with the wind's breath around the chimneys. Holmes did not move. His eyes, half closed a moment before, opened fully, adjusting to the near dark, registering each sound with that curious blend of scientific detachment and keen human interest that made his vigils as restful to his mind as sleep might be to another's. "All will be revealed momentarily," he had assured our hosts. Yet even he could not have foretold the next addition to that nocturnal chorus. For now, beneath the murmurs and the honest creak of old timbers, there came another note, the soft, deliberate slide of something solid against wood, as if a panel, long accustomed to secrecy, yielded by inches. Then, unmistakably, the cautious tread of a foot upon a hidden stair, each step measured, each pause attentive to any answering sound. And at last, so close that it seemed to touch the very air beside his chair, Holmes heard it, the faint scrape and press that no pipe, no settling beam, no playful echo could imitate, the steady, purposeful movement of a human hand at work, somewhere within the wall behind him. He sat upright then, every sense awake in the quiet gloom, and turned his head slightly toward the sound, knowing that whatever emerged from that secret darkness would decide whether this was merely a clever trick of acoustics, or the opening move of a mind as patient and calculating as his own. Holmes did not move at once. He waited, very still in the cushioned darkness, until the faint, deliberate tapping came again from within the paneling, followed by the softest scrape like a cautious shoe upon a narrow stair. The library, which had seemed a creature of restless whispers, now felt instead like a stage on which someone, somewhere behind the walls, had missed their cue. There was a muffled click. A narrow panel, flush with the carved bookcases, eased inward by an inch, and a thin blade of shadow cut through the dim firelight. Holmes was already on his feet. With one smooth motion, he drew the panel wider and stepped aside, and in that quiet, almost ceremonial gesture, intercepted the figure emerging from the hidden stair. It was no specter. A man in his late middle years, with the stooped shoulders of one long accustomed to carrying trays and secrets, froze on the threshold, one hand still clutching the mouthpiece of a brass speaking tube. His eyes, wide and blinking in the low evening light, went from Holmes to the empty armchair and back again, as if he had walked into the wrong scene of his own carefully rehearsed drama. "You need not be alarmed," Holmes said, in a low, even voice that scarcely disturbed the air between them. "There will be no shouting tonight, and no accusations, only an explanation. Come, let us settle in, get comfortable, and speak as men who both know this house rather well." The butler, Watson, recognized him now as Mr. Elmsley, the longest-serving retainer of the family. Swallowed, his Adam's apple rising and falling in the soft glow from the hearth. For a moment he seemed as though he might bolt back into the shadows of the secret stair, but Holmes's calm gaze held him as gently and firmly as a hand upon the shoulder. The quiet of the library, broken only by the soothing sigh of the wind in the chimney and a distant patter of rain along the leaded panes, invited confession. "You have been using the tube," Holmes continued, indicating the coiled brass that disappeared into the wall, "and the old servant stair, to give voice to the legend of this room. The knocks in the paneling, the whispers when the fire burns low, those are yours. Why?" The answer came out on a breath. "To keep them away, sir. To keep them all away from here." He sank onto the edge of a chair, the speaking tube resting across his knees, like some discarded instrument. In halting phrases, with many glances toward the shelves that concealed the hidden passage, he told us of documents locked in a narrow press off the stair, old correspondence, unsigned drafts, and a brittle packet of legal papers that, if calmly examined, might call into question the present ownership of the house itself. Was it so strange? He asked in a small voice that a man who had given his life to this place should fear seeing it pass into hands that regarded him as part of the furniture. He spoke of a promised pension that had never quite materialized, of a younger heir who laughed at tradition, of decisions made in bright London clubs while the old house stood here in the country, listening. In the silence of those long evenings, he had found that the building's own peculiar acoustics, the speaking tubes that carried whispers from floor to floor, the hollow cavities behind the paneling, the way a footstep on the sealed servant staircase could bloom into a distinct tread within the library, offered him, for the first time, a kind of power. "Fear is a curious thing, Watson," Holmes murmured, not unkindly. "It can be more comfortable than uncertainty, can it not?" Elmsley nodded miserably. By feeding the legend of the haunted library, by timing his soft knocks to the turning of the key and his murmured phrases to the dying of the fire, he had found he could steer the family's movements, keep prying eyes from the hidden press, and, in some quiet corner of his mind, believe that the fate of the house still depended upon him. The story obeyed him, even if no one else did. "You have wronged no one irreparably," Holmes said at last. "You have frightened them, yes, but you have also preserved what you feared they would waste. All will be revealed momentarily, but not in the manner you dread. We shall see that your anxieties are heard without recourse to ghosts." He rose and offered the man his arm. Together they passed through the concealed door and into the narrow servant corridor, whose chill stone and whispered drafts felt far less uncanny now that the human heart beating at their center had declared itself. The house, as we walked back along its quiet passageways, seemed suddenly like a theater after the curtain has fallen, its tricks and trapdoors visible in the softened light, ready not to terrify, but to be understood, and in understanding, to carry you toward peaceful sleep rather than restless imagining. It was, perhaps, the kindest of finales to such an uneasy chapter that the house itself should be invited to listen to its own explanation. By daylight, the library was almost cheerful, the winter light lying in pale rectangles upon the carpet, and the fire, newly laid, burning with a steady, comfortable glow that sent soft reflections up the rows of leather spines. The family had been gathered at Holmes's quiet request, and we who had known that room in its brooding evening temper could now, as it were, settle in, get comfortable, and regard it in a gentler aspect, like an actor unmasked between scenes. Holmes stood with his back to the mantel, his long fingers resting lightly upon the carved stone, and when he spoke it was in that unhurried, almost pedagogical tone which, as I have often observed, can make even the driest point of mechanics sound like one of those soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. "You have," said he, letting his gaze travel from one anxious face to another, "a house that whispers even when no mischief is afoot. Our culprit did not create the voice of this room, my dear sir. He merely learned its language." He began with the speaking tube, whose innocent brass mouthpiece peeped from the paneling beside the desk. In the quiet of the night, when the wind pressed against the old walls and the fire had sunk to a dull red eye, a single soft word breathed into that tube from the sealed servant staircase behind could travel with uncanny clarity, emerging here as a disembodied murmur. The staircase itself, long closed and boarded, formed a narrow, resonant shaft, its wooden treads, chilled by the night air, creaked and settled, so that a cautious foot could time its movements to the natural chorus of the timbers and remain all but indistinguishable from them. "Observe, too," Holmes continued, touching the mantel with a measuring hand, "the construction of your flue. In the small hours when the cold tightens every joint, The iron throat of the chimney contracts, pulling upon this concealed hinge. At his pressure, a narrow panel, cleverly set into the paneling, stirred and opened with a low, sigh-like groan that seemed, in that bright room, almost comical in its pretension. At midnight, with the fire low and the shadows deep, would you have sworn so readily that it was only wood and metal complaining of the temperature? He spoke then of the pipes that ran behind the walls, old water lines and heating conduits that knocked and whispered as the pressure altered, producing at fairly regular intervals a double tap, a faint scrape, a distant drip. The mind, once persuaded that it listens to a haunting, he remarked, is a most industrious editor. It will arrange these random notes into footsteps that halt outside a door, into phrases half heard and yet curiously apt. Have you not noticed how, when you lie wakeful in the quiet, even the rain at the window seems to spell out your own thoughts? Into this already eloquent architecture, the human agent had merely to introduce a few well-timed interventions. On nights when the wind promised a lively conversation with the eaves, and when the cooling flue would, as he had learned, nudge its secret panel with that mournful exhalation, he took his station at the far end of the sealed stair, breathing a name, a warning, a broken sentence into the tube at the precise instant that a natural creak or knock provided cover. Thus the random became deliberate, the accidental arranged itself into a reply, and the house, which had always talked in its sleep, appeared now to converse. Holmes's glance, as he concluded this gentle reconstruction, held no accusation, only a kind of grave compassion for the frailty that had seized upon such means. "Your home," he said softly, "has been made a partner in a little drama of fear and remembrance. All will be revealed momentarily in its human aspect. For the present, let us understand that the room itself is innocent. It is only old and full of memories." He turned slightly toward the door, where the quiet figure whose heart lay at the center of it all waited, half in light and half in shadow, to step forward and complete the story that the house had so clumsily begun. "Breathe with me as we begin that final chapter," Holmes murmured almost to himself, and the fire, as if in answer, settled with a gentle, reassuring sigh. Holmes's words faded into the soft crackle of the fire, and in the quiet that followed I became aware, with a faint start, of my own breathing and of the curious lightness that comes when tension has at last uncoiled. The library, which only a few nights before had seemed to brood and listen like some sentient thing, now lay about us in a simple, comfortable hush, its shadows no longer suggestive of lurking presences, but merely of worn bindings and familiar wood. I drew my chair a little nearer to the hearth. The evening had deepened. Beyond the tall windows, the snow-bound grounds were a blur of pale gray, while the wind, that erstwhile conspirator in the house's supposed haunting, had dropped to a low, continuous murmur like distant surf. In that gentle sound, and in the occasional settling sigh of the chimney, I heard again how readily my own mind had once leapt to interpret every creak as a footstep, every stray whisper of draught as a voice calling faintly from behind the shelves. It is a curious truth that silence is rarely complete. When overt noise is withdrawn, when the last log has fallen inward and the flames burn low, the ear, deprived of its usual companions, begins to search, and the brain, ever eager for pattern and story, supplies what the senses cannot quite confirm. In old houses, with their hidden cavities and long corridors, this tendency becomes a kind of private theater. A bookcase, expanding with the day's warmth and shrinking with the night's chill, will emit a small report, and at once we imagine a cautious hand upon the panel, a length of old water pipe, sighs or knocks, and we hear the measured tread of an unseen walker on the stair. As a medical man, I have sat in many a quiet parlor while a patient, lowering their voice as if the very walls might overhear, has described the strange nocturnal sounds that robbed them of rest. A tapping that came always at 2 o'clock, a low moan in the passage, a whispering in the chimney that seemed, on certain damp evenings, almost to form words. How often, on investigation, have these terrors resolved themselves into some mundane cause? A loose shutter, a nesting bird, a defective flue that carried a neighbor's late conversation along its length like one of those Victorian speaking tubes that make children laugh by day and grown men shiver by night. Yet disappointment was rarely their response. Rather, there came over them a deep, settling relief, as though the very ordinariness of the explanation were a blessing. The unknown, I have learned, can weigh more heavily upon the nerves than any honest draught under a door. To know that the whisper is merely wind, that the footsteps are the house itself adjusting to the quiet, is to have one's imagination gently led back from the edge on which it has been poised. In this, Holmes possesses a singular gift. He listens as others do, but he does not listen with fear. To him, each creak is a datum, each faint vibration in the paneling a clue in some extended sentence which the building is unconsciously writing about its own construction. I have watched him stand motionless in a dim corridor, head slightly inclined, while a series of knocks traveled through old pipes from cellar to roof, and I have seen in his eyes not the wide stare of superstition, but the narrowed, almost affectionate gaze of a man tracing a familiar map. Where another might ask, "What if it is a ghost?" he inquires instead, "What precisely is knocking, and why at this hour?" That simple alteration of question is, in itself, one that I have attempted, with varying success, to prescribe to my more anxious patients. This evening, as I sat by the library fire and allowed my thoughts to drift, I felt the subtle working of that remedy upon my own mind. The room which had once seemed to breathe and murmur in the small hours was now, under Holmes's patient exposition, revealed as a place of tricked acoustics, of concealed passages and cleverly employed vents, of timbers that spoke at regular intervals because the temperature and the wind commanded them to do so. The so-called voices were nothing more than sound traveling along unsuspected channels, much as a rumor moves through a household, changing timbre, but not its simple origin. The pattern interrupt, if I may borrow a term from another discipline, lay not in the house, but in the sudden intrusion of reason into a narrative that had long been allowed to run unchecked. And yet, I do not find that the rational explanation has stripped the place of its poetry. On the contrary, there is a quiet wonder in knowing that wood and stone, pipe and panel can conspire under certain conditions to mimic the cadences of human speech. Just as there is a certain dignity in the way an old staircase announces the hour with its accustomed creak, we may settle in, get comfortable with the thought that our ancestors, lacking our knowledge of acoustics and architecture, did their best with the tools they had, clothing their uncertainty in tales of visitations and restless spirits, where we now speak of air pressure and echo patterns. Holmes, I reflected, has never sought to rob the world of mystery. He merely insists that we distinguish between mysteries that can be solved and those that must simply be lived with. The former he approaches with his violinist's ear for nuance, his ability to pick out a single thread of sound from a crowded room and follow it back to its source. The latter he acknowledges with a slight inclination of the head, as one might salute a distant ship whose course does not intersect one's own. In both cases, his calm acceptance has, over the years, done more to steady my own nerves than any draught or powder in my medical bag. I thought too of you, perhaps listening now in your own quiet room, while the evening draws its curtain and the small characteristic sounds of your dwelling begin their nightly recital. How many times have you paused, half amused and half uneasy, at a floorboard's complaint or a faint tapping in the wall, wondering for a heartbeat whether the explanation lay beyond the ordinary? If you breathe with me as we begin to reframe such moments, you may find, as I have, that they become less a summons to anxiety and more a reminder that you are not alone, but held within a living structure that responds, in its own slow language, to wind and weather and the changing temperature of the night. For myself, I felt a gentle gratitude steal over me as the fire settled and the last of the evening's business slipped from my thoughts. The library, once a chamber of whispered dread, had become once more simply a room, a place for books, for the quiet exchange of ideas, for those soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep when conversation has dwindled and only the embers remain. The heavy door, which I had seen locked with something like apprehension, now promised not confinement, but privacy. The high shelves, stripped of their spectral associations, stood ready to offer nothing more alarming than a forgotten volume of sermons or a well-thumbed romance. Even the armchair in which our anxious host had once sat, listening for every imagined footfall, seemed to invite only one destiny now, a long, undisturbed slumber beneath the watchful, indifferent gaze of 100 leather spines. When at last I rose, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, the house answered with a series of small, familiar sounds. A board adjusting, a window rattling faintly in its frame, a distant door closing on some errant draught. They no longer spoke of ghosts to me. They spoke of age, of weather, of the ordinary life of a building that had stood through many winters and would, God willing, stand through many more. And as I extinguished the last lamp and left the library to its rest, I did so with the contented certainty that, for this night at least, its silence would be of the most comforting kind. Not the tense, listening hush of fear, but the deep, untroubled quiet in which both houses and men may finally sleep. Outside the great house the evening had deepened, yet the world was not dark, for the snow gave back what little light remained, so that the drive and lawns lay in a soft pearly dimness that seemed almost to glow of its own accord. The windows of the manor shone out against that pale expanse like a row of watchful, kindly eyes, no longer brooding over secrets, but simply observing in quiet companionship as we took our leave. The air was cold and very still. Our breath rose in faint clouds, mingling with the gentle fall of flakes that drifted down through the shadows, settling on Holmes's coat and on the brim of my hat in a fine white dust. Behind us, the front door closed with a subdued click, and for a moment we stood upon the steps, listening to the muffled sounds within, the ordinary, domestic whispers of a household returning to its comfortable routine, now that its imagined specters had been laid to rest. The carriage that bore us back to the station moved slowly along the snow-muffled lane, its wheels turning with scarcely a sound, while beyond the hedgerows the fields stretched away into a gathering blue-gray dusk. It was the sort of quiet, reflective interval in which one might, if one wished, settle in, get comfortable in one's thoughts, and allow the mind to drift from puzzle to peace. You may perhaps feel something of that same gentle unwinding as we follow them now. At the little country station the lamps were already lit, casting circles of amber light upon the platform and sending long wavering shadows out across the whitened tracks. Presently the midnight express slid in with a low, sustained sigh, the glow from its carriage windows promising warmth and rest. We found once more a compartment to ourselves, and soon we were enclosed in that familiar cocoon of soft upholstery, drawn blinds, and the steady, soothing rhythm of wheels beating time upon the rails. The countryside slipped past in darkness beyond the glass, only an occasional distant light marking some sleeping village or solitary farm. Within, the lamp above our heads hummed faintly, and the air was scented with coal smoke and the faintest trace of wet wool steaming gently dry. Holmes sat opposite me, his long legs stretched out, his eyes half closed, yet I knew from the slight movement of his fingers upon the arm of the seat that his mind still ran, swift and clear, along the tracks of the evening's inquiry. He spoke at last in that low, even tone which, more than once, has served for me as one of those soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. He touched, without emphasis, upon the speaking tubes and concealed corridors by which sound had been gathered and redistributed, upon the old pipes that sighed and knocked in sympathy with the wind, upon the human fear that had clothed these innocent contrivances in the garments of a haunting. "Ghosts, Watson," he murmured, "are often nothing more than timbers settling and consciences stirring at the same hour." His words blended with the murmur of the train until they became, for me, almost indistinguishable from it. My head grew heavy. The line of his profile against the lamplight wavered and doubled. The next question I had meant to put to him was it about the sealed staircase or the forged letters, slipped away before it reached my lips. Somewhere far off, a whistle sounded, long and low, as if the night itself were drawing a slow, deep breath. When I woke, it was to the gentle jolt of buffers and the sight of familiar ironwork sliding past the window. London had received a light fall of snow in our absence, and Baker Street lay under a thin, pure covering that softened its accustomed angles and dulled the clatter of passing cabs. The lamps made small golden islands in the quiet, and the pavements shone faintly where the snow had begun to melt into a fine, almost invisible rain. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with a subdued but unmistakably relieved greeting, her voice and manner as reassuring as the warm air that flowed from the hall. In another moment we were ascending the well-known stairs, shedding coats and scarves, and stepping into the sitting room that had so often been our harbor after stranger seas than this, the fire newly built up, the gas turned low, Holmes's violin case in its accustomed corner, my own chair drawn up with a kind of unconscious forethought to its favorite angle beside the hearth. There is, I have often thought, no luxury quite equal to returning from some remote, echoing place to the intimate scale of one's own domestic surroundings. The restless library, with its breathing walls and watchful shadows, already seemed to belong less to our waking life than to that borderland of memory which lies between experience and dream. You too, perhaps, may feel the day's more insistent impressions beginning to fade at the edges now, as if the mind, like our frosted boots, were leaving its traces only lightly upon the threshold of the night. Holmes, having lit his pipe with a spill from the fire, sank into his chair and let his head fall back, the blue smoke rising in delicate spirals that mingled with the lamplight. "You will set it down, Watson?" he asked, not opening his eyes. "In your own fashion, of course." "I shall," I answered, though even as I spoke I felt the weight of sleep pressing gently but irresistibly upon my eyelids. Outside, the city's innumerable sounds had been softened by snow and distance into a single press, low murmur, not unlike the fading echo of the train upon the rails, and within our rooms all was warm and still, save for the occasional, companionable crackle from the grate. It is at such an hour that even the most tenacious problems may, without dishonor, be laid aside. The mind, which has followed every clue and peered into every shadow, is at last permitted to loosen its grasp, to let unanswered questions drift for a time like flakes beyond the window, unheeded and unresolved. Breathe with me as we begin that gentle surrender, as Holmes allows his thoughts to dim and I let the pen slip, metaphorically, from my fingers. For the night is long, and there will be other cases, other rooms that will not stay silent. Yet as I banked the fire and turned down the lamp, there was one small, curious detail from the manor which, though I had not mentioned it to Holmes, returned to me with unexpected clarity, so slight a thing that it might perhaps have no bearing at all. And yet, as you will hear, it was destined to draw us once more from Baker Street into the snow-bound countryside before many evenings had passed. And so the fire in that distant manor sinks back into its embers, and the last of the snowbound echoes grows still, leaving only a quiet room, a shaded lamp, and the soft memory of Holmes's keen profile against the window pane, as if he were listening not merely to the fading whispers of the case, but to the silence that follows. If your own eyes are already heavy, if the edges of the story have blurred like ink and evening rain, that is quite all right. You may have followed every footstep along those draughty corridors, traced every deduction through the library's shifting shadows, or you may have drifted in and out, catching only a phrase here, a soft detail there, as the narrative flowed past like a slow, dark river. Either way, your mind has been gently occupied, given something calm and measured to rest upon, and now it is free to let go completely, to loosen its hold on clocks and questions, and simply sink into rest. We want to thank you in this quiet moment for keeping company with us in the world of Holmes and Watson, for walking beside them through the snow, and for sitting, in imagination, by the low fire of that uneasy library which would not stay silent. Even if you are only half awake, listening from the edge of sleep, your presence here is felt, as though you were another comfortable chair drawn up near the hearth, another listening figure in the soft circle of lamplight. Though you lie where you are, perhaps in a darkened room with only the faintest glow beneath the door, you are not alone in this listening. All across distances and time zones, in city flats and country houses, in places where the rain taps gently at the glass, and in rooms where the night air is very still, there are others who settle in, get comfortable with these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, sharing this same quiet company. It is a small, unseen community, linked not by noise, but by the decision to choose something soothing, something low and kind, at the close of the day. If your eyes are still open, and only if it feels easy and unhurried to do so, a simple like, a quiet subscription, or any small gesture of support helps these cozy Gothic mysteries carry you toward peaceful sleep on many more evenings to come, finding their way softly into the dark. For now, let there be nothing more you need to do, and nothing more you need to remember. Allow your thoughts to move slowly, like snowflakes falling through lamplight, each one softer and less distinct than the last, until they fade altogether into a gentle, welcoming darkness. May your room be calm, your blankets comfortable, your breath steady and untroubled. May any tiny creak in the floorboards, any faint whisper in the walls, be only the quiet settling of a house at peace, a world at rest, while you drift down and away into deep, unbroken sleep. And so we come very gently to the edge of things, where the story grows quiet and the night takes over the telling for us, in its own slow, patient way. The amber glow of our imagined lamps has already dimmed, each one lowered in turn, until only a soft suggestion of light remains, like the last ember in a grate that no longer warms the room but still remembers the fire.
If you are still with us,
still hovering in that comfortable space between waking and sleep, you might like to take one last, easy breath, deep but unforced, letting it fill you slowly and then drift away again, as though it were a small cloud dissolving into the evening sky. Feel, if you will, the simple weight of your body, the quiet honesty of it, supported completely by the bed beneath you, or the chair, or the sofa, every limb given permission to loosen, to lengthen, to grow pleasantly heavy and still. The room around you need do nothing at all. The ceiling may lie in shadow. The curtains may stir a little in some distant current of air. There may be a faint whisper of rain against the glass, or the almost inaudible ticking of some unseen clock. Yet all of it belongs now to a world that can look after itself without your attention. For this small span of time, you are allowed to simply rest, to settle in, get comfortable, to let the mind grow as unhurried as the light fading from a winter window. If thoughts continue to move through you, as thoughts so often do, you might imagine them as the distant sounds in that snow-bound manor we have left behind, muffled by thick walls and long corridors, never quite reaching this quiet chamber where you lie. They can come and go, those echoes and impressions, while you remain where you are, steady and safe, listening only to the soft rhythm of your own breathing, the soothing rise and fall that has been with you through every evening you have ever known. And should there be another night, perhaps soon, when your own room feels too full of remembered voices or restless questions, when the silence seems to carry more sound than comfort, you are always welcome to return here, or to any of our soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. These stories will be waiting, as the fire waits in the grate for a match, patient and uncomplaining, ready to burn low and warm beside you whenever you choose. We will be here, in Baker Street and beyond, in trains and manors and quiet London streets after rain, with Holmes by the window and Watson by the fire, both a little blurred at the edges by lamplight and time, yet always willing to keep a gentle watch while you drift. You may not hear the end, and that is perfectly all right. All will be revealed momentarily or on some other evening, when wakefulness is less shy and sleep less insistent. For now, let us leave Baker Street at rest. The fire has settled to a low red glow, the last curl of smoke rising in a lazy spiral before it disappears into the chimney's dark. Outside, the city has drawn its own curtains. The footsteps in the street have grown few and far between, and even the distant wheels on the cobblestones seem softened, as though wrapped in a thin layer of fog. Within, Holmes has set aside his violin, the bow resting across the strings in a silent promise of music another night, while my own notebook lies closed upon the table, its pages filled for now with all that needs to be remembered. The gas lamps along the staircase are turned down one by one, each little flame bowing itself out with a final delicate flicker until only the faintest line of light shows beneath the bedroom doors. The house breathes once, as old houses do, a tiny settling of boards and beams, and then grows still. In that stillness, we offer you a final, almost whispered good night, a quiet blessing folded into the dark. May these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts always be near when you need them. May they carry you toward peaceful sleep whenever you call. Let the last of the words fall away now, like snowflakes melting on a window pane, leaving no trace but a cool, clear silence. Baker Street is sleeping. The city is hushed. Your own room, in its own time, will follow. and you, in the gentle darkness that remains, may simply let go. Good night. Good night. Good night.